We need to encourage people to do source water protection. We also need to think about things like water conservation programs, which probably haven't been as fully exploited or utilized as they could be. And they may even start talking about perhaps water reuse issues. There are places in Pennsylvania, particularly around the State College area, where they're actually using wastewater for beneficial reuse. And I know there's a community in Adams County that also is involved with using gray water for some of their non-potable needs in the Cashtown area. Basically, that's what I had for tonight. If you have any questions about groundwater, groundwater quality, groundwater protection, source water protection, feel free to contact me. My email and phone number is there. If you have information related to water use planning or the state water plan, another section within my division, Dave Justensky in the water use section, he can be reached at that phone number. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a ring. And in closing, I'll leave you with this image of one of the ways that you can help manage a source water protection area by posting these water supply area signs that are in PennDOT sign catalog. You have to have a DEP approved wellhead or source water protection program in order for PennDOT to erect the signs, but it alerts transporters of hazardous materials and the motoring public and emergency responders that you're in a critical area for protecting a water supply. So I didn't know if you wanted to take questions or wait till the panel, Alan. So I guess we can take a couple of questions if anybody has any.
And I'll have you go sit at the table for the questions, okay? All right. So everyone, thank you very much to Pat for the... So Pat's going to join the rest of our panel for a question and answer session for half an hour or so. Joining him will be Dr. Christopher Voltamata, professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Science here at Shippensburg. Dr. Voltamata has his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a specialist in water resource management, hydrology, geomorphology, and stream and wetland restoration. My favorite project that he has been involved with is that he was the co-principal director of the successful effort to restore the Bird Run stream channel right here off campus, a riparian zone and floodplain right down the street. Also joining the two will be Mr. Michael Christopher. He's the manager of Washington Township in Franklin County, a position he's held for nearly 35 years. Among many other initiatives, Mr. Christopher has worked on creating and developing Pine Hill Regional Recreation Area, Red Run Park, and Happles Meadow Wetland Preserve, as well as the township's underground storm water retention program. He currently serves on the Potomac Basin Regional Water Resources Committee and is working on developing a number of water-related ordinances for the township. So I will let our two other panelists introduce themselves briefly, and I'll take things open for questions. So.
Evening. Are we on? Yeah. I'd like to really thank Pat Bowling for a fantastic overview of many of the issues in this area, and especially raising some of the challenges we have with water quality and water quantity in the area. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief for the moment, and we can move to some questions. But I do want to make the point that there's an enormous collective expertise assembled in this room, and to some extent we're kind of preaching to the converted here. We've got representatives from many of the local watershed associations, the conservation districts, and so on. And I would really encourage people to keep involved in these issues and let your expertise and your thoughts be known at the local municipal level. There are many, many ways to get involved in these issues. Simply attending public meetings, or often filling a position on a local board, whether it's a water supply authority, whether it's a zoning planning board, or something like that. Many of these water issues are tied to the daily decisions we make at the municipal level, And they're really great opportunities to affect the way we manage the landscape and the way we treat our water resource that are just waiting for people to take the initiative and be involved. I'll let Mike Christopher introduce himself, and then we can take some questions.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just a local municipal official, been in the business for a long time, and have dealt with many issues. Our main goal is to protect the Chesapeake Bay as best we can with everything we do. Our thought process in Washington Township for any project is, what's the overall effect down at the bay? We like those little things that we love to eat, so we got to make them healthy. And with that in mind, I've spent a lot of time on the Potomac River Basin Commission. I'm fully aware of the problems in Adams County, and we spend a lot of time over there. And I don't know how many folks are here from Adams County, but you do have some interesting issues. Thank goodness in Franklin County, we're in the headwaters, but we're well served with water, and we're pretty lucky. With that, I'll end and be willing to answer any of your questions.
There are just mics right here if you don't mind coming up and asking.
Thank you for a great presentation. From Adams County, so I'm going to talk specifically about that. Your earlier graphic showed roughly 50% of the water from rainwater runs off and 50% is evaporation. I think we're well versed in containing water through rainwater recovery methods, rain barrels, things like that. But how would we mitigate evaporation if that's 50% of our water loss? Thank you.
That's a really good question, and off the top of my head, I'm not really sure how you would mitigate something like evaporation unless there's some way you could somehow minimize the contact time between the water and the atmosphere somehow. I don't know if maybe covered reservoirs or coverings over waterways, like, particularly waters that are being used for water supply. I don't know if that might be a way to do it or not, but I've never really thought about that, so I'm kind of drawing a blank. I don't know if maybe Dr. Voltamati might have an idea, since I know he knows a lot more about water conservation.
Oh, that's really a great question, and I think the answer is you simply can't do it. That's a natural part of the hydrologic cycle that we have to live within, and so even though we're very blessed to have about 40 inches of annual rainfall here, you just simply can't count on being able to access and use all of that. I know in drier parts of the western U.S., they've gone after the other part of that process, transpiration by plants, by removing a lot of non-native species, especially along agricultural irrigation canals and things like that would remove even more water from the system. In hydrology, we often refer to effective precipitation as that part of the precipitation that's then available later on from places like streams and groundwater where we can access it. And you simply really have to let nature have that 50% that's going to go to evaporation, that's going to fuel someone's rainfall downwind, and that means really we have about half of the water that we have available to us.
I have a question about one of the things that struck me was the ways in which limestone kind of acts as both a blessing and a curse, in that it allows it allows water to move through it, but it also allows all these contaminants to move through it. I know that all three of you in various ways have dealt with those issues of the ways in which contaminants move through limestone formations. What are the biggest threats in your mind, in your particular areas of groundwater contamination, in terms of popping up in places where we might not expect, or ways in which it sort of moves far away from the source of the pollution?
Well, let me just try to craft a response with regard to the immediate area around Shippensburg. Those of you who aren't familiar with our local water supply system, as Alan pointed out at the beginning, we do get some water from the Letterkenny Dam all the way across the valley on North Mountain, but the vast majority of our water in Shippensburg comes from 3 wells that are drilled up near the base of South Mountain into the limestone that, as Alan was pointing out, is both the blessing and the curse. The great thing is in the geology that we have in this area, we get phenomenal productivity. So we have very high producing wells that allow us to serve a pretty sizable population here, really with basically just 3 water supply wells in the area. The other piece of that is those wells are recharged with water which is almost entirely coming out of the Michaud State Forest, which has fantastic water quality, and so we're kind of insulated from some of the land use impacts that Pat Bowling just spoke about, whether they are the transportation corridors or the agriculture and so on. But I can tell you, looking to the future, the Shippensburg Borough Authority, our local water provider, is already wondering when we are going to have drilled enough wells in that particular area, and we're going to have to start to look elsewhere. As we start to look elsewhere, you're moving into those parts of the landscape where you're much more vulnerable to some of the common contaminants that come from those other land use impacts. So it becomes more of a challenge. And in my view, that's where conservation plays an enormous role. We can lower our footprint, lower our take on the resource by simply using less of it. And there are many, many ways to do that very economically. And as we look to the future, we should always be thinking not just about how we can expand the supply to serve more people, but how we can also reduce our demand and live within that resource that we have.
Probably 20, 25 years ago, there were some farms in Washington Township where the feedlot drained right into a sinkhole. And good stuff was going right directly into the water. And we tried to corral those things and stop them, and we worked with farmers, and that was a big source of problem years back. We think we got most of those rounded up in our area, and they're doing the proper management of their feedlots. Other places that are potentially in the future, the geothermal wells, and the potential with the open systems to have bad things get back into the groundwater because they're down into it and taking it out, and sometimes if something bad happens can get back in, and then it pollutes a whole area. So those are the agricultural potential into sinkholes, which for those of us with gray hair can remember that a lot of folks, the sinkholes were where you threw all the bad stuff, and that's right into the groundwater. And in the future, it's the geothermal wells that could cause some problems we need to be careful with.
Thanks, Mike. Particularly, I saw that you are in the process of developing regulations for geothermal wells, or in Franklin Township. That was just interesting to me that was that connection between those two.
That process is in the go right now. It's been slowed down a little bit. Legal got a hold of it. Any attorneys in the room? As soon as legal gets done with all their final review, which I understand occurred last week, while I was away, those ordinances will be coming forward. It's geothermal, and we have 3 circles of influence around our water sources. In the Ring 1, none are permitted. In Ring 2, some closed systems are permitted. In 3, and then in the rest of the township, the open systems are permitted, but we're going to take a real hard look at trying to prohibit most of those if we can. Wellhead protection, there's 2 ways of looking at it. We've had in place for years the proper construction of wells. That ordinance was put in place probably 20 years ago, maybe 15. Time flies when you're having fun. But that's been in place, and we think that's very valuable considering the wells are out in the areas without public water. You have a septic system usually 100 feet away. We try to keep them as far away as possible, but sometimes that's not possible. And so if you don't have it grouted right and you don't have the still in the right place, you can have the potential for bad stuff getting back into the water system. So we've taken care of that, and we now have wellhead protection on the way, and we're also looking at stream bank protection with a riparian buffer ordinance along the Antietam Creek. And those things are in the works, but none of it's easy, and you have to be careful. A couple years back, the board brought an ordinance that was a little too restrictive, and they got hammered, and it didn't get passed. Compromises are in the works, and we're looking at some things to try to make that possible. So that's what's going on in Washington Township.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I live along Falling Spring in Chambersburg and grew up in Newville, close to the Big Spring. And curious about the flow. I know in the Big Spring seems to be pretty similar to what it always was, but I understand the Falling Spring outside Chambersburg, the flow over a period of time has decreased a lot. Is that because of the number of wells in that area? Is there specifically?
I'm not real familiar with the area, but if there's been a lot of development, that's probably, very, very possible when you're seeing, flows from springs decrease, or usually it's being captured somewhere else. So it's likely, but I'm not really familiar with the area off the top of my head.
Could that just be simply like a naturally occurring cycle for a spring? Is that possible?
Yeah, I guess it could be possible. There could be something going on with the fractures, possibly some of them getting plugged up by something. There might have been a change in groundwater chemistry that allowed something to precipitate or something. So that's a possibility too. Could be a combination of the two also.
I think congratulations. I think you've managed to stymie our panel of experts, if that's possible.
Let me make just one other comment about that, though, that, Pat started his presentation with a nice depiction of the hydrologic cycle and spent a bit of time talking about groundwater recharge. It is key to maintain open spaces, especially in those parts of the landscape where recharge processes are high. And I know in some of the surrounding states around here, there have been very aggressive land use planning efforts to identify critical recharge areas for groundwater and to minimize the footprint of impervious areas in those places. A lot of the municipalities around have ordinances that speak to that, but very, very commonly there are zoning variances granted, and there are relatively large continuous impervious areas from shopping districts to housing and so on, and that can have an impact on the amount of groundwater in an area and therefore the flow of springs.
Actually, having heard Dr. Voltamati's response there, that's probably more likely what's going on, or it could be a combination of all three of those things. But obviously, if your area's being developed and things are being paved, and they're just, doing it the old-fashioned way with, impervious surfaces, and you're reducing the amount of recharge, that could probably do it just as easily as extra withdrawals in the groundwater system. I wanted to take this opportunity real quick to Dr. Dietrich Ward's last question about the carbonate terrains and unexpected contamination. I think about the only response I could come up with for that would be, I think that underscores the importance of adequately characterizing your resource so that you don't run into any situations where unexpected things happen. In a lot of ways, groundwater science has progressed a lot, here in the last 20, 30 years, and there should be something done more than just, reading literature about the area and looking at some maps. There should actually be some, actual in the field testing and some really good characterization of the resource so that you wouldn't be in a situation where something unexpected would happen. And that also goes back to the idea of wellhead protection. By understanding where your water comes from and what your threats are, then you're in a position to either minimize those threats or perhaps eliminate them or be able to deal with them, or have even an early warning system in place, particularly in a carbonate terrain, to let you know that, oh man, something's going on, we need to take action or do something.
Thanks for the presentation tonight. A lot of great information. I think there was mention, maybe Dr. Waltamata, about trying to reduce our footprint One thing that's caught some interest more out west is the reuse of wastewater. I think from an engineering perspective, we're probably there, but do you see from a public perception and maybe from an economic driver in this area? I mean, we saw Adams is distressed, but the rest of the state may not be as bad. Do we ever see that coming to PA or even somewhere in the U.S. right now?
Do we ever see it coming? Absolutely. How quickly do we see it coming is another question. I often attend the annual meeting of the American Water Resources Association, and they had a pretty lengthy special session on exactly this topic last fall, and most of the attendees were from drier parts of the country. I know one of the major systems doing a lot of wastewater recycling is Austin, Texas. San Antonio has done quite a bit, and their initial efforts there are to use treated wastewater for non-drinking water sources, so what they call the purple pipe that routes water to things like irrigation projects in city parks and golf courses and things like that. So they're able to capture quite a lot of wastewater that way. It is starting to be used in some places for a domestic supply for drinking water and such as well. There's no real chemistry argument why we shouldn't do that. It's more of a public perception and getting people to think of that as an additional source of water rather than just a waste stream. You know, obviously, if you're in a municipality that needs to expand the supply, that may be a viable option. In terms of impact on the hydrologic cycle and so on, you're still essentially taking more water out of the system, and you might have the same impact on downstream streams and so on. But I think certainly you're right. We're going to see more and more of this in the future, and not just in drier areas, but probably in Pennsylvania too.
As I meant or alluded to in the presentation, the University Area Joint Authority around State College is actively doing a beneficial reuse program now where they're taking treated wastewater and I think they're infiltrating it back into the ground up in the headwaters of one of the creeks up there above where some of their well fields are. So it's being done at least there in Pennsylvania. And I also know Loudoun County, Virginia just built a new wastewater plant where they also have the capabilities of using gray water for non-potable supply also. So I think, as Dr. Voltamati said, I think it's more overcoming the perception, but I think we'll see more and more of it, you know, in the future as, you know, the demand for water increases.
If I go again?
Be my guest.
Pat, you talked about private wells in PA don't have to be permitted. I mean, it still floors me to this day, especially with the regulations we have on public water suppliers. In your 20-plus years with the department, have you seen many cases of illness, sickness, any big outbreaks from contamination from private water wells? Is that prevalent or something you don't see very often?
I don't know how many cases of actual illness or I don't know of any outbreaks associated with it, but rarely you hear anecdotal now and then about, like, you know, well, you know, one of my relatives from out of town was here visiting me, and they got sick. Because what happens a lot of time, from how it's been explained to me, is that, you know, if you have a septic system and you also have a private well, chances are you're not going to be as susceptible to the bacteria since it came from you originally, but other people might be. So I've heard instances where, like, you know, they had relatives from out of town that were staying with them for a while, and they, you know, developed an illness that they suspected was related to that. But as far as any large-scale outbreaks or any individual cases where it was definitely documented, I can't say that. But I would like to share this one little anecdote, and it's kind of relates to how the legislation, the draft legislation for the private water well stuff came about during the last session. Representative McElhenney from Montgomery County has a farm up in, I believe it's up near Mansfield somewhere, Tioga County. He was up there was staying there for a while, and he got sick, and he suspected it was related to his drinking water supply because there was a lot of gas drilling activities going on. So he got his well tested, and the only thing they really found was the bacteria, and this sort of prompted him to get involved with getting this legislation going. So it kind of an interesting little anecdote as to, how something like that, spurred, action.
Nothing like getting representatives sick to get legislation going, huh? We'll take one more question.
So we had 10 watershed-related groups here tonight. What could they do to help each of you individually with source water protection plans, academia, and at the municipal level?
Yeah, if I may, I think that's a really great question because Christopher started out talking about the ways in which we can go from translating the big picture ideas here, right? Kind of the big stuff that's that's out of all of our hands, except for maybe Pat, because he's the faceless bureaucrat who makes things happen. But I think that's a really great question. I mean, how does this relate? How does all of this stuff relate to what we deal with every day, to people out, trout fishing, to people thinking about what kind of fertilizers to put on their lawn, to, to students who might be tracking, doing some of this testing and tracking, where water is migrating to in their classes? That's a great question.
I agree. That's a really good question, Adam. Probably off the top of my head, I think the best thing that the watershed groups could do is just as you're gaining knowledge about these things, you could sort of act as salesmen or somehow promote this idea, or at least know who to contact or who to connect somebody with related to these issues. I think that might be one of the best things, and also having knowledge of how the source water program works or something like that. Being able to explain that simplistically to somebody and tell them this is who you need to contact, I think would go a long way in trying to raise awareness of this, particularly if you try to tie in the economic angle that source water protection can not only save you money, but it'll protect public health, and it'll save money by hopefully either maintaining or possibly improving the quality of your drinking water. And even for people, and I know sometimes the watershed specialists with the districts are dealing with rural folks, and even though they may not be on a public water system, their children or relatives may go to school in a town that's served by a public water system. So they may not think it means anything to them, but if you help them connect, well, your kid's going to school there and drinking this water, 180 days a year or whatever, it might help, them to, support this, because I think whatever we can do to let our elected officials know about these things and bring these subjects up, it's going to get on their radar screen.
I couldn't agree more. First of all, really, really excellent question, and I think there are many, many ways that groups like that, with the great members and expertise that you have, can help. But my answer is basically two words: public education. There's so many ways to get this word out. My experience with local newspapers and press is they're almost always looking for a good story. If somebody's willing to write a press release, write a letter to the editor, even there have been requests in this area to have people write a regular column in the newspaper and so on. And you go to an event like this and you feel like people really understand these issues, but you talk to the average citizen out there who's not thinking water 24/7 like I am, and they're not necessarily as informed as you would hope. And so even very basic messages are very, very useful. Just so, for example, in Pennsylvania, the number one use of water in your household is flushing the toilet. Okay, probably most people don't know that. If you still have an old, outdated fixture, you can go to Lowe's and buy a new low-flow toilet for about $100. That is going to pay for itself on your water bill in less than 4 years. Okay, In Shippensburg, we're fortunate that our water is relatively cheap. Those of you who are supplied by some of the other companies in the central Pennsylvania area pay considerably more, which is of course unfortunate, but replacing your toilet will pay for itself even faster. Okay? If we get that kind of information out to people, as well as messages on water quality and environmental restoration and so on, I think it goes very, very far.
To plug our local watershed association, the Antietam Watershed, they do have a column in the local paper each month or every so often that gives information and education to folks. But in the bigger picture, the expertise from the watersheds needs to be directed in a kindly basis and a kindly way to your elected officials. And instead of being adversarial with elected officials at the local level, watershed folks need to be cooperative and helpful and work with the elected officials, and the honey gets a lot of bees. And work with your local officials, and over time you'll be able to develop programs through the local governments that will be very effective in managing water. Washington Township in the late 70s started a program where we ran drain spouts into the ground in either tanks, drainage pits, and over the years there's probably 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 of those out here in Washington Township, and when the big rains come, there's not the peak that we used to have way back because a lot of water disappears. We think we're recharging a lot of wells downstream from us, and it's roof water, and one could argue maybe there's some bad stuff getting into it, but I don't think so. There's a lot of ground in between because we're in those limestone areas, and there's a lot of topsoil, and a lot of these pits result in a lot of water going to ground and not running off. The big message that I'd like to give tonight is that local government officials are really easy to get along with if you work with them. And contrary to what some people think, the township supervisors and the borough council folks, or the folks at the local level, have the ability to make things happen. We're responsible for land use planning. We're responsible for making things happen that affect the environment. And if you want to make change and to have innovative ideas, you got to work with and educate your township supervisors and your borough officials of why this is better for them in the long run than just doing it the way they always have. So it's just food for thought. Work with, and I think you'll see some very positive results over time. Thanks.
Well, with those words of wisdom from a man long versed in the battleground that is local politics, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and to thank all of you for joining us here on the South Mountain Speakers event. Thank you so all very much. Thank you all. Have a great evening and safe trip home.